In a nation that once rebelled against monarchy, the phrase "no kings" has come roaring back. From New York to Nevada, millions of Americans have taken to the streets to remind their leaders, and perhaps themselves, what kind of country the United States was built to be. It started quietly. A handful of grassroots organizers, teachers, veterans, nurses, began sharing one sentence across social media. No kings, not now, not ever. Within weeks, that phrase had become a movement. By mid-October 2025, it was everywhere, on banners, in tweets, on homemade t-shirts, and on the lips of protesters stretching from coast to coast. The immediate spark came during a bruising season for American. Politics, government agencies were shuttered. In the longest shutdown since 2019, federal workers were unpaid, social services stalled, and the administration had ordered National Guard deployments to enforce new immigration directives. Critics warned that power was concentrating in the hands of one man, a president behaving, in their words, like a king. Then came the moment that lit the fuse. During a televised address, Donald Trump declared that the presidency carries powers no court can take away. To his opponents, it sounded less like confidence and more like coronation. Within hours, protest pages multiplied online. Organizers began planning what they called a day of democracy. At first, even sympathetic observers doubted it could catch on. After all, Americans had protested many things before: climate policy, racial injustice, abortion rights, but uniting millions around a single, abstract idea like executive overreach seemed impossible. But this time, the anger wasn't confined to one issue. It was about tone, about language, about the creeping fear that the guardrails of democracy were bending, perhaps breaking. One organizer in Chicago told reporters, "We're not here because we hate Trump. We're here because we love the Constitution." That sentiment spread faster than any slogan. Church groups printed it in Sunday bulletins. Labor unions added it to flyers. By mid-October, the words "No Kings" had evolved from a protest cry into a civic oath. Within a fortnight, organizers in more than 2,700 cities pledged participation. The Guardian reported that it would be the largest single-day protest since the Women's March of 2017. CNN called it an unprecedented convergence of local outrage and national anxiety. And by the weekend of October 18th, 2025, America woke up to a new chapter in its history of dissent. What began as online chatter had transformed into something else: a roar. Buses rolled out from small towns before dawn. College students skipped midterms to march. Grandparents packed lunches and handmade signs reading, "Rejecting kings since 1776." Even in deeply conservative counties, small groups gathered in courthouse squares, waving American flags turned upside down, a symbol of distress. This was not a fringe demonstration. It was a cross-section of the country itself: union workers, suburban parents, veterans, retirees, clergy, immigrants, teenagers. Different lives, one shared conviction that power must always answer to the people. For many, the chant carried history's echo. 2.5 centuries ago, Americans fought a war to rid themselves of a king. Now, in 2025, they were invoking that same spirit, not against a crown across the ocean, but against something they feared at home. The New York Times described it as a civic awakening, messy, improvised, but undeniably massive. And as sunrise rolled from the East Coast to the West, it became clear the protest wasn't just a reaction to one man's words, it was a referendum on what democracy means in modern America. In 2025, amid division and economic strain, millions of Americans found common ground in a single declaration: no kings, and this was only the beginning. October 18th, 2025, a day that began like any other, but by noon, it had become one of the largest days of protest in American history. From the steps of the U.S. Capitol to the beaches of California, a sea of people filled the streets. The number stunned even the organizers themselves. New York City alone saw more than 1.3 million marchers. Washington, D.C. surpassed 500,000. Chicago, Seattle, Atlanta, Denver, Dallas. Every city center pulsed with the same chant, echoing through megaphones and open windows. No kings. No kings. Reporters described scenes that looked less like a protest and more like a national festival of democracy. Families marched with strollers. Veterans wore their medals. Students carried pocket-sized copies of the Constitution. At every corner, there were signs. We, the people, still matter. Power belongs to the public. History repeats, if we let it. For a nation long divided by race, class, and ideology, the visual was extraordinary. In Los Angeles, truck drivers stood shoulder to shoulder with Hollywood writers. In Atlanta, pastors led hymns between chants. In Portland, environmental groups walked beside libertarians waving Gadsden flags, reinterpreted with the phrase, "Don't crown me." The BBC's coverage captured the mood perfectly. Their correspondent described it as a protest not of chaos, but of conscience. No looting, no violence, only the low, steady hum of a population rediscovering its voice. The movement was decentralized by design. There was no single leader, no national committee, no celebrity face of the campaign. Instead, coordination happened online through encrypted apps and volunteer networks. Thousands of local marches shared a unified message but customized their focus, some for free speech, others for judicial independence or voting rights. The unifying thread was opposition to unchecked presidential power. By late afternoon, drone footage showed the scale in staggering detail. From Boston Common to San Francisco's Civic Center, avenues turned into rivers of people, their movements choreographed by conviction rather than command. Al Jazeera called it a democratic renaissance. The Guardian called it America's protest without borders. But inside the country, the atmosphere was far from celebratory. The government shutdown and still ongoing had already disrupted daily life. Paychecks were frozen, federal buildings closed. Air traffic controllers and postal workers joined demonstrations, holding placards reading, "We serve the people, not a king." In some cities, police departments took the unusual step of marching alongside citizens. In Madison, Wisconsin, an officer was seen holding a sign that read, "Protect and serve, not rule." The moment went viral within hours. Still, not everyone was cheering. In conservative media circles, commentators dismissed the movement as manufactured outrage. Supporters of the former president accused protesters of staging a rebellion against the ballot box. But for those on the ground, the motivation was deeply personal. A retired Marine in Texas told reporters, "I fought for a republic, not a dynasty." A teacher in Florida said, "My students memorize the Bill of Rights, but they don't get to see it in action. Today they do." A young immigrant in California simply said, "We came here for freedom, not for rulers." As the day progressed, chants evolved into moments of silence, waves of quiet spreading through crowds as organizers read aloud from the Constitution. When the words, "We the people," were spoken, tens of thousands raised their hands in unison. It was less protest than ritual, a reaffirmation of the country's founding promise. By evening, city lights illuminated exhausted faces and discarded signs, but the message remained unmistakable. Across political divides, across generations, Americans were demanding a reminder that power in this country is borrowed, not owned. CNN summed it up in a single sentence. On a Saturday in October, America remembered that it has no kings, only citizens. And while the streets began to clear, the real question was just beginning to form. Would Washington listen? Every protest has a message. Sometimes it's about wages, sometimes it's about rights. But the No Kings movement wasn't demanding money or even specific policy changes. It was demanding something far deeper, a reminder of who holds the real power in a democracy. In the words of one organizer interviewed by the New York Times, "We're not marching against a man. We're marching against the idea that any man can stand above the law." That statement, calm, simple yet cutting, became the heartbeat of the movement. From the beginning, No Kings was never just about Donald Trump, though his words had ignited it. It was about the trajectory of American politics itself, the slow, steady erosion of accountability, and the rise of personality over principle. As the marches spread, so did the symbolism. The crown became the most recognizable image. Some wore cardboard, crowns crossed out with red paint. Others burned golden, paper replicas in public squares and on thousands of signs. The words "No Kings" were printed in stark black letters against plain white backgrounds, the visual simplicity making it impossible to ignore. Historians and commentators quickly noticed the resonance with America's past. The phrase echoed the spirit of the 18th century, when the country's founders fought to free themselves from monarchy. Then, it was King George. Now, protesters warned, it could be anyone who saw themselves as untouchable. CNN's coverage called it a mirror held up to power, not a rebellion, but a reflection. In interviews, participants kept returning to the same themes: transparency, rule of law, institutional checks and balances. A law student in Boston said, "When we say no kings, we mean no one gets to rewrite the rules because they don't like how they're written." An elderly woman in Philadelphia, clutching a flag folded neatly under her arm, told a reporter, "We've seen empires rise and fall. It starts when leaders forget they serve." The Al Jazeera feature took a global view. For much of the world, the United States has been the loudest voice for democracy. But this weekend, that voice came from its people, not its politicians. The message, in essence, was reclamation, reclaiming ownership of the nation's democratic identity. Reclaiming the Constitution from partisan interpretations. Reclaiming the meaning of patriotism from blind loyalty to active responsibility. Analysts noted a generational dynamic, too. The protests weren't led by traditional activists, but by younger Americans, students, gig workers, creators who had grown up in a digital world where information and misinformation collide daily. They were skeptical of authority, yet fiercely idealistic about democracy. Their chants were less about anger and more about accountability, and for many, the timing couldn't have been more symbolic. The government shutdown had exposed how fragile the system could become when political power is treated as a weapon rather than a trust. Federal courts were backlogged, food assistance programs delayed. Millions of families felt the pinch of dysfunction, and No Kings became the rallying cry for a population tired of being collateral damage. Across social media, short clips went viral. An elderly veteran saluting the crowd, a group of students reciting the preamble, parents teaching their children why Americans once rebelled against monarchy. Each clip carried the same message. Freedom demands participation. The Guardian summarized it in one headline. No Kings, a protest for the idea of America itself, and that was the truth of it. Beneath the slogans and speeches, the No Kings movement wasn't simply political. It was philosophical. It forced millions to ask a question that had been buried under years of noise and division. What does democracy look like when the people stop watching and start acting? By the end of that weekend, it was clear that the protests weren't just against Trump. They were for something much bigger, for the belief that in America, power is temporary, but the people are not. The chant that once sounded like defiance began to sound like a vow. No kings. Not now, not ever. If the No Kings protests revealed the heartbeat of public sentiment, the reaction from those in power revealed something else: the tension between authority and accountability. Within hours of the first marches, the White House released a statement dismissing the movement as, quote, theatrical noise from the radical left. Officials described protesters as disgruntled bureaucrats and professional agitators, claiming the demonstrations were designed to undermine the president's constitutional authority. The message was clear. The administration wasn't backing down, but the pushback wasn't just verbal. In Washington, several agencies quietly instructed employees not to comment publicly on the protests. In some cities, local police were ordered to maintain crowd control readiness, bureaucratic code for preparing riot gear. Even as the protests remained overwhelmingly peaceful, it was a strange contrast. A calm uprising met with defensive posture. Inside the Capitol, lawmakers split along predictably partisan lines. Republican allies of the former president dismissed the protests as performative democracy, while Democrats framed them as the last stand for constitutional checks. But the divide wasn't purely political. Several moderate conservatives, particularly younger lawmakers, publicly acknowledged the legitimacy of the movement. Senator Claire Jensen of Arizona, a Republican, said in a press briefing, "You don't have to hate the president to love the Constitution." Her words went viral, not because they were radical, but because they sounded rare. News networks amplified every angle. CNN aired a montage of peaceful rallies, juxtaposed with statements from government officials calling them un-American. Fox News countered with footage of small fringe groups burning effigies, framing the entire movement as anti-government hysteria. Social media became a battleground. Hashtags like No Kings Movement trending alongside "I'd defend the presidency." The Guardian noted the irony. A protest meant to unite citizens around democracy has instead become a mirror of the nation's deep polarization. But behind the noise, quieter shifts were taking place. Legal scholars and former federal judges began releasing open letters, warning of the dangers of executive exceptionalism, the belief that presidential power stands above judicial and legislative limits. Several universities hosted emergency panels on constitutional interpretation and civic education. In short, America had begun debating itself in classrooms, on talk shows, even around dinner tables. The administration, however, doubled down. During a televised rally in Texas, Trump referred to the protesters as actors in a bad play, claiming that "no one loves freedom more than I do." Supporters cheered, waving American flags and chanting his name, while outside the arena, counter-protesters raised signs reading, "Freedom isn't loyalty." The clash was ideological, two visions of patriotism colliding head-on. To his followers, Trump's defiance was proof of strength. To his critics, it was proof of monarchy in everything but name. By late October, the Department of Homeland Security confirmed it was monitoring potential disruptions linked to the protests. Civil liberties organizations quickly pushed back, warning that surveillance of peaceful protesters would be unconstitutional. The American Civil Liberties Union filed a series of FOIA requests demanding transparency. Meanwhile, on the streets, the movement showed no signs of fatigue. Smaller protests continued daily, especially in front of federal buildings and courthouses. Each gathering carried the same message: "We are still here." A BBC report described the phenomenon as slow burn descent, not explosive, not chaotic, but relentless. Journalists began drawing parallels to other historical movements, from the civil rights marches of the 1960s to the anti-war protests of the early 2000s. But there was a key difference. The No Kings movement wasn't demanding the passage of a law or the end of a war. It was demanding restraint, a rare protest in favor of limits, not liberation. This paradox made it both powerful and difficult to counter. How do you argue against people asking for less power in government, not more? Inside think tanks and newsrooms, analysts started using the phrase constitutional populism, a grassroots demand to return to foundational principles rather than rewrite them. For the first time in decades, ordinary Americans were quoting Federalist Papers, debating separation of powers, and carrying pocket constitutions as protest symbols. Al Jazeera's analysis summed it up bluntly. The world has seen many uprisings for more freedom. The No Kings movement may be the first mass protest for humility, and in that humility lay its greatest challenge to power. Because while governments can suppress noise, they struggle to silence conviction, and conviction, once awakened, doesn't disappear overnight. Every movement has its machinery, the unseen gears that make it run, and while the No Kings protests appeared spontaneous, what unfolded across America was anything but unplanned. Behind the signs, chants and sea of flags lay months of quiet coordination, digital strategy, and the shared determination of people who believed the country had reached a moral tipping point. It began in chat groups, small, private circles of teachers, lawyers, veterans, and nonprofit organizers who had crossed paths in earlier civic campaigns. Many had backgrounds in the 2017 Women's March or the 2020 Black Lives Matter demonstrations, but this time, the mission was broader, not about one issue, but about the system itself. There was no headquarters, no boardroom, no celebrity figurehead. Instead, leadership was horizontal. Each city had its own volunteer coordinators, each bound by a simple code. No parties, no endorsements, no violence. The movement's online home, a decentralized platform hosted on open-source servers, became the digital heart of the operation. Thousands of volunteers logged in daily to access protest maps, legal briefings, printable flyers, and safety checklists. A software engineer from Oregon designed a tool that allowed users to locate their nearest march just by entering a zip code. Within 48 hours of launch, it had logged more than 10 million visits. Funding came from small donations, 5, 10, sometimes less. In a world of billionaire-funded politics, that mattered. It reinforced the movement's image as people-powered and independent. Inside these networks, voices emerged, not as leaders, but as anchors. One was a 29-year-old civics teacher from Michigan, known online as Liberty Bell. Her short explainer videos breaking down sections of the Constitution were viewed more than 50 million times in a single week. She told one journalist, "You can't defend democracy if you don't understand how it works." Another was an 82-year-old retired judge from Vermont, who live-streamed from his living room, reading passages from the Federalist Papers and answering questions from students. When a teenager asked, "Do you think democracy can survive this decade?" he smiled and said, "It depends on whether you show up." That spirit of mentorship defined the No Kings ethos. It wasn't rage that united them. It was education. Marches opened with readings of the preamble. Town halls turned into civic lessons and social media feeds that usually spread. Memes and outrage began sharing scanned copies of historical documents. The New York Times described it as a civics class turned into a revolution. Labor unions joined early, sensing a broader fight about dignity and fairness. The service workers. Alliance pledged logistical support, offering buses and security volunteers. Teachers' associations provided printing resources. Even veterans groups joined, some marching in full uniform to symbolize loyalty not to leaders, but to the republic itself. Behind the scenes, legal experts worked tirelessly to ensure marches stayed within the law. Volunteer lawyers trained organizers on protest rights, coordination with police, and de-escalation tactics. Their message was firm. If we break the rules, we lose the argument, and yet the passion was undeniable. Across the nation, people found new purpose in participation. Churches opened their doors as rest centers. Cafes offered free water and Wi-Fi for protest coordination. In small towns, local librarians became unexpected heroes, printing signs, hosting discussions, and teaching children why the phrase "No Kings" mattered. The movement was also profoundly diverse. Immigrants who had fled autocracies marched beside descendants of America's founding generation, not indigenous. Groups carried their own banners reading, We never had kings, we had councils. African, American communities drew historical lines between their long fight for civil rights and this renewed struggle for democratic accountability. It wasn't perfect. Disagreements often broke out online, about tone, about the risk of politicization, about how long the movement should last. But even in conflict, participants shared one unshakable rule: stay peaceful, stay principled, stay proud. By late October, international outlets had begun calling "No Kings" the most organized, spontaneous protest in modern U.S. history, a paradox that revealed the discipline of a democracy still trying to remember how to protect itself. The BBC's correspondent summed it up in a single line: "It is rare to see a protest where the central demand is not for power, but for the restraint of it." Inside the movement, that paradox wasn't confusing. It was the point. Because at its heart, No Kings wasn't just about resisting a presidency. It was about reviving citizenship. It was about a country rediscovering the quiet, stubborn strength of its first and oldest idea. That power, no matter how loud it gets, still answers to the people. When the chants faded and the signs began to curl under autumn rain, something unusual happened. The movement didn't disappear. It evolved. Instead of retreating into silence, America started to talk. In homes, classrooms, town halls, and online forums, people debated what it truly meant to be a republic. The No Kings protests had shaken something loose in the national consciousness. For years, the United States had been locked in cultural combat: red versus blue, urban versus rural, truth versus spin. But for one weekend, millions had found common ground not in what they wanted from government, but in what they refused to accept: the rise of unaccountable power. In the weeks that followed, reflection replaced confrontation. Political analysts called it the quiet aftermath. Cable news anchors spoke more cautiously, perhaps realizing that the audience, the people, had grown weary of outrage. At universities, professors reported record turnouts for lectures on constitutional law and civic ethics. High. School teachers introduced new units on checks and balances. Bookstores sold out of copies of the Federalist Papers and Democracy in America. It wasn't a revolution of power. It was a revolution of awareness. The Guardian described it as a national mirror moment, a time when Americans, after years of noise, stopped to ask themselves what kind of democracy they were really living in, and the questions ran deep. Had the nation become too comfortable with strong men? Too forgiving of corruption? Too cynical to care until it was almost too late? The protests had cracked open those questions, and for once, they weren't dismissed as partisan. They were personal. A documentary filmmaker who covered the marches said, "It wasn't about left or right. It was about gravity." Everyone felt the pull of something bigger than politics. That gravity, the awareness of fragility, reminded many that democracy is not a permanent structure. It's a contract renewed with every generation. Internationally, reactions were mixed but fascinated. European leaders expressed admiration, calling it a self-correcting moment. State media in authoritarian countries mocked it as proof of American instability. But quietly, analysts across the globe admitted this was democracy doing what it was meant to do, correcting itself in public view. CNN aired a special titled "America in Reflection," documenting how the protests reignited civic participation. Clips showed college students forming discussion groups, veterans registering new voters, and small towns hosting Constitution nights, where people read founding documents aloud by candlelight. The message was subtle but profound. The crisis wasn't just political, it was spiritual. It was about memory, about whether Americans still remembered the idea that government is not a ruler, but a reflection of its people. And in remembering, something else began to shift. Voter registration surged in multiple states. Local elections, long ignored, saw record turnout. civic nonprofits reported massive increases in volunteers. The No Kings protests had reminded millions that democracy isn't defended only by ballots, but also by belief. The BBC noted a curious detail. When asked if they were optimistic about the country's future, 64% of respondents said yes, the highest number in a decade. It wasn't that problems had vanished. The shutdown was still unresolved. The political divide still raw. But for the first time in years, Americans seemed to believe again that their collective voice mattered. One historian called it the most democratic act in a generation, not because of what they changed, but because they cared enough to try. For a nation that had spent much of the decade drifting between outrage and apathy, this reflection felt almost sacred. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, and deeply American. Because the No Kings movement had revealed an uncomfortable truth. Freedom doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes in silence, when citizens stop paying attention. And so in 2025, millions decided to pay attention again. They realized democracy isn't something you inherit, it's something you practice, and that practice, the messy, imperfect, human effort to hold power accountable, had just found its way back into the heart of a nation. When the last chance of No Kings faded into memory and the streets cleared, America found itself standing at a crossroads, not of collapse, but of decision. The protests had ended, but their echo lingered in the halls of Congress, in the newsroom debates, and in the quiet reflections of ordinary citizens who had finally seen what collective power could look like. For the first time in years, it wasn't politicians driving the national conversation. It was the people. In the weeks following the protests, lawmakers began introducing a series of bipartisan bills aimed at tightening oversight on executive power. One proposed legislation would require automatic judicial review of major presidential decrees during government shutdowns. Another sought to strengthen whistleblower protections inside federal agencies. Neither bill promised to solve the deeper problems, but they signaled something new, an understanding that citizens were watching, and this time they weren't going away. Media outlets, too, adjusted their tone. For years, cable news had thrived on division and outrage. Now, even the most partisan commentators began acknowledging the shared anxiety that had fueled No Kings. The movement, they realized, had united Americans across ideological lines, not by party, but by principle. Political strategists called it the democracy correction. It didn't dismantle the system. It rebooted it, and while former President Trump continued to dismiss the protests as media theater, reports surfaced that several of his advisors had urged him to adopt a more conciliatory tone in public. According to The Guardian, one senior aide put it bluntly, "Sir, people aren't protesting you. They're protesting the idea that anyone can't be questioned." That idea, the insistence on accountability, became the real legacy of No Kings. Across the country, grassroots organizations transformed themselves from protest groups into civic alliances. In Boston, the 1776 Coalition began offering free classes on constitutional literacy. In Seattle, volunteers formed a watchdog collective tracking executive actions and their legal limits. In Dallas, veterans launched the Republic Project, a mentoring program that teaches high school students about public service and civic duty. These were not political movements, they were civic ones, and slowly, they began reshaping the national mood. The tone of discourse softened, not by magic, but by exhaustion. Americans had learned that outrage could draw crowds, but only responsibility could sustain change. The BBC described it as a country learning to breathe again. After years of noise, silence began to sound like progress. International observers took note. In Paris, the Le Monde editorial board praised the U.S. for remembering the muscle of its democracy. In South Korea, newspapers compared the protests to their own candlelight movement that had restored faith in government years before. Even in nations less friendly to dissent, citizens quietly shared clips of No King's marches online, proof that people-powered accountability was still possible, even in the 21st century. But inside America, the question persisted. Would it last? History, after all, has a short attention span. Protests fade, policies shift, and public energy drifts back into private life. Yet, many who marched in October 2025 refused to let that happen. Instead of slogans, they built systems. Instead of riots, they wrote petitions. Instead of despair, they organized discussions. The New York Times captured it best. The movement's greatest success may not be what it stopped, but what it started. A national conversation about humility, accountability, and the fragile art of self-governance. Months later, when the government shutdown finally ended, reporters asked one of the original organizers whether the No Kings movement had achieved its goal. Her answer was simple. The goal wasn't to win. The goal was to remind, and perhaps that was the point all along. In a time when democracy around the world seemed under strain, from populism to polarization, the United States, despite its flaws, had demonstrated something extraordinary: the ability to confront itself without collapsing. The No Kings protests didn't overthrow a regime or rewrite a constitution. They did something subtler and maybe more powerful. They reminded a generation that freedom is not inherited, but renewed. That the only crown worth wearing in a democracy is the one shared by every citizen. Responsibility, as one sign left behind in the streets of Philadelphia read, "The throne is empty, and that's exactly how it should be." And so, the story of No Kings isn't really about protest. It's about preservation. It's about millions of voices whispering the same truth the founders once shouted to a king across the sea. Power belongs to the people, and only the people, no kings. Not now, not ever.